Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and this will be part 3 of the video series on programming and periodization of Olympic weightlifting training, and this one is all about creating the mesocycle. To create a mesocycle, we first need to form a basic structure to follow. So we need to establish how many weeks the mesocycle will be and what the overload to deload ratio will be. Generally, a mesocycle is usually around 3 to 5 weeks of overloading training with a 1 week deload. This means that 3 to 5 weeks will be focused on progressing training, while the deload week aims to maintain adaptations while reducing fatigue. For this example, let's use a 4:1 overload to deload ratio, so the mesocycle will be 5 weeks in duration. The first week will be the deload week, and the next 4 weeks will provide an overloading stimulus. Now that we have our mesocycle structure established, we can plan in detail the methods of progressive overload we will apply. We will use the microcycle that was created in part 2 of this video series to apply these progressive overload principles too. Competition lifts don't usually need to have progressive overload applied to them, since they are a skill rather than a strength quality. Therefore, it is probably best to auto-regulate competition lifts rather than prescribe exact numbers to lift. Since we have already established general categories of intensity that the athlete will be lifting each day in the previous video, we can simply have the athlete lift somewhere in this range. On days when the athlete is feeling particularly good, the heavier end of these ranges can be lifted. On days when the athlete is not feeling particularly good, the lower end of these ranges can be used. For our example, we will simply program ranges for each competition lifting session and allow the athlete to auto-regulate these sessions based on how they are feeling. So we can see here that Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday are light sessions where the athlete will only work up to a 60% load. Wednesday uses a moderate range where the athlete will work up to 70 to 90% depending on how they are feeling. And Saturday uses a 90+% range where the athlete may attempt a new personal best if they are feeling good. For the strength exercises, the progression model should be intentionally periodized for best results. There are 3 primary progression models we can employ for the strength lifts. These are an accumulation progression, an intensification progression, and a realization progression. Let's now cover these 3 models and how they can be applied. An accumulation progression model is where we increase volume via increasing the number of sets performed, while the intensity or load lifted in this case remains the same. This model usually uses lighter loads with higher rep ranges, since high volumes with heavy loads may lead to injury. The goal of this progression model is to promote structural adaptations and variation to training. So we are trying to have the athlete build muscle mass and work capacity while providing a somewhat novel stimulus. Here is an example of how this may look in a program. We start with our strength exercises from the general microcycle created in the previous video, and our 5-week mesocycle structure. As we can see here, we have 2 squat sessions and 2 pulling sessions. We've chosen the back squat for Monday and the front squat for Thursday. We'll also use stiff leg deadlifts rather than the classic pulls on Wednesday and Saturday, since these exercises will be more effective for hypertrophy purposes. So we have the stiff leg deadlifts with a snatch grip on Wednesday and with a clean grip on Saturday. Next, we need to establish the volume to be used. For each exercise, we will start the first week with 2 sets per exercise, since it is the deload week. Then each week will progress in volume by adding 1 set for the squatting exercises and 1 set for the pulling exercises. So we can see here that in week 2, we have a total of 5 sets of squats, in week 3 a total of 6 sets, 7 sets in week 4 and 8 sets in week 5. And the same progression of volume has been applied for the stiff leg deadlift exercises too. We now need to select a load for each exercise. These loads should remain the same for each week, since the progression already comes from the increases in volume over the mesocycle. So we should select loads that roughly correspond to a rep range of around 6 to 10. For this athlete, let's say they will use 130 kilos for the back squats on Monday, 100 kilos for snatch grip deadlift on Wednesday, 110 kilos for front squats on Thursday, and 120 kilos for clean grip stiff leg deadlifts on Saturday. The second progression model we can implement is an intensification progression. This is where the loads used increase throughout the mesocycle while volume remains the same. So essentially, the load lifted increases each week while the number of sets remains stagnant. The goal of this progression model is to build neural adaptations specific to the movement we are trying to get stronger at. Lower rep ranges with heavier loads should be used for a mesocycle with this progression model. Rep ranges of around 3 to 6 with appropriate loads are a good range to employ. For example, an intensification mesocycle may look something like this. We've kept the back squats for Monday and the front squats for Thursday, but the stiff leg deadlifts have been changed to snatch and clean grip deadlifts, since they are more specific to the competition lifts. As we can see here, the number of sets for each exercise remains the same, except for week 1, as this is the deload week. So 2 sets have been used for week 1, and 3 sets have been used for the other 4 weeks. The number of reps have been set and don't change over the mesocycle. We can also see here that the loads used increase by 5 kilos each week, making week 5 the heaviest week of the mesocycle. And the last progression model we can implement is a realization progression. This is where the number of sets decreases each week while the load lifted increases. This progression scheme has the goal of decaying fatigue while simultaneously performing the most specific training methods for performance to peak the athlete. Here is an example of how this may look in a mesocycle. The back and front squats have been kept the same as the previous 2 mesocycle examples. However, the snatch and clean deadlifts have been replaced with the classic snatch and clean pulls, since these are the most specific form of strength training to the competition lifts. As we can see here, the number of sets performed decreases each week. 3 sets are performed per exercise in week 2, and this reduces to 1 set per exercise in week 5. The number of reps performed also decreases each week, meaning that the load lifted will increase simultaneously. The load doesn't necessarily need to be prescribed, since it should increase naturally due to the reps and sets decreasing. And finally, we need to also consider how accessory training should be progressed over the mesocycle. This is the least important training method to apply progression for, and tracking progress doesn't need to be as rigorous. The best way to progress accessory training is using a hypertrophy progression approach. There are many ways to progress hypertrophy training, which can be found in other videos on this channel. However, we will go through the fundamentals of how we can progress these accessory exercises. The primary concern with accessory lifts is to progress reps performed and load lifted over time in the 6 to 15 rep range. We don't want to use loads heavier than this rep range, as this will unnecessarily tax our joints and connective tissue, and it will also not provide us with the adaptations that we are after. For this example, let's use an auto-regulated approach for each exercise. So we have prescribed a specific load and a specific number of sets each week. We also have the reps in reserve decreasing each week, meaning that the athlete is taking each set closer to failure. Therefore, more reps will be performed naturally over the course of the mesocycle. We can also see here that the number of sets for each exercise is lower in week 1, since this is the deload week, and the rest of the week uses a higher number of sets. Let's now put these progression schemes together to create a completed example mesocycle. So we can see here that the competition lifts have a range that has been prescribed, the strength lifts in this example follow an accumulation progression model, and the accessory lifts follow an auto-regulated approach. In the next video, we'll be covering how training can be periodized over time to reach peak performance for a competition. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.